In many ways, the Banshee Titan is a modern enduro interpretation of the Iron Horse Sunday, the classic, the legendary downhill bike. Find out what that means and how it's performed so far in this long-term review on loamwolf.com. Let's go. Nope. Yes, this is the Banshee Titan version 3.2, the latest version of their longest travel enduro bike. It's a 155mm rear travel, 170mm fork with a pair of 29-inch wheels as standard, but it can be selected to have a 27.5-inch wheel in the rear if you're looking to obtain a little bit more clearance, thanks to a replaceable dropout which corrects the geometry for it. As with all the Banshee mountain bikes, this is a full 7005 aluminium frame with 7075 machined aluminium linkages. It uses their KS2 suspension system, a dual link design, quite similar in looks to the DW linkers found on the Iron Horse Sunday that I likened it to earlier. And it just allows Banshee to obtain the kinematics that they desire to give the Titan the performance that they think it deserves. There's a couple of neat details on the frame of the Titan that I'll point out just now and talk about a little bit. But if you want to learn all the nitty-gritty details, then do head to the website in the description below, where we'll link and really talk about every little detail of the Titan. The Titan uses Banshee's shock cage design. It is a forged section that goes around the shock and isolates all of the suspension forces into that one single unit, allowing them to really tailor all of the stiffness and strength into that area and allow the rest of it to be a little bit more flexible and lighter weight and compliant, just to really tailor the characteristics of the frame to their liking. And the rest of the frame is given highly hydroformed and shaped tubing throughout, just to tailor and put the stiffness and strength in the right places and minimize the weight elsewhere. Of course, you get a water bottle, plenty of room inside the front triangle for that. The frame pivot bearings are all nicely sealed. There's a quite minimalistic, I'd say by today's standards, chainstay protector on there, but it does a fairly good job at keeping noise to a minimum. And then there's the rear dropouts, which allow you to choose between a high and low position for that bottom bracket, allowing you to correct the geometry for a 27.5-inch or a 29-inch rear wheel. And they also offer regular and long options, letting you choose the geometry and also squeeze in a really big, meaty 29-inch tire in the rear, if that's to your preferences. Talking about the geometry, and the Banshee is definitely in the modern realm of numbers. Definitely not crazy in terms of the reach at 470mm for this size large, but quite high in the stack, which gives you a really nice high and commanding position on the bike. The chainstays are fairly long at 452mm, totaling a 1270mm wheelbase in total. And then you've got a fairly reasonable 77° or so effective seat tube angle and a 64° head tube angle. Talking about that KS2 suspension system, it's a dual link system with two co-rotating links, much like that classic DW link system on the Iron Horse Sunday. It gives you 155mm of travel. It's optimized for either a high volume air or a coil shock. And yeah, certainly the kinematics are selected so that you can definitely choose between a coil or an air shock. It's got 27% progression in there, fairly high levels of anti-squat to keep you really nicely supported when you're pedaling, and then a fairly neutral braking characteristic, meaning that whether you're on the anchors or not, the rear end works fairly well, but it still provides a little bit of geometry correction to keep you comfortable in the steeps. Banshee doesn't offer their bikes in full builds. Instead, they work with select dealers and bike shops, such as BC Suspension, where I got this one from, to put together a build spec that's really tailored to their customers' preferences. You can pick up the Titan frame with a Fox Float X2 shock for $2,599 or £2,099, and then it's up to you to spec the bike how you like it, and of course that's going to determine the final price. The build that BC Suspension put together on the Titan retails for around about £6,500, and it's certainly high quality throughout. It's maybe a slightly more modest wheel set and drivetrain with a mechanical drivetrain on there, but certainly high quality components, powerful brakes, burly tyres, good suspension as well, highly tunable, the latest and greatest suspension from RockShox. The result is a fairly portly build, coming at 38 pounds or 17.25 kilos, but certainly you could shave weight off of this thing very easily. But I'm quite a fan of the burly build, proper downhill tyres on there, burly wheel set, absolutely no nonsense. And because I was testing this thing primarily in the Alps, I was very thankful for it, although I did have a chairlift, So that definitely helped to offset the extra weight and the penalties there. But anyway, that's enough talking about the Banshee Titan in the tech specs. Let's talk about the most important thing, how it's been riding on the trails across Scotland and the rest of Europe. Wow! No idea how I did that. So, thanks to the help of BC Suspension, a bike shop in Grantown-on-Spey in Scotland, I was able to pick up this Banshee Titan 3.2 and yeah, certainly get provided with a custom build that was really to my liking, much like a customer would be able to. There was no components on here I was complaining about at all. The shock was delivered with the right spring rate on there for me, as per Ben's recommendation, the owner of BC Suspension. So yeah, it was really quite an easy process to get this bike, hop on it and get the fork into a good place and then start to attack the trails. And attack the trails is exactly what I did. I spent the majority of testing time on this bike on lift assisted trails in the Alps, really riding some of the roughest, the gnarliest, steepest trails that I typically find myself riding. And at no point did I really feel like the Banshee was getting out of its element until it really got to downhill bike only terrain, which, given that it's only 155mm travel enduro bike, you know, certainly less than many of the bikes that we're seeing these days, is really quite impressive. And I think definitely a testament to not only Banshee's kinematics, which have been selected very nicely for this bike, but also to the capabilities of the new RockShox suspension and the tuning potential that they really offer. Certainly, getting the bike set up was no problem at all, and it was yeah, a quick process to get myself ready to hop on it and really get proper testing it. Of course, being an enduro bike, typically you're going to be pedaling the bike up the hill for a long time to get yourself to the top of the proper worthy trails to go back down on. And thankfully, Banshee has not forgotten about the climbing needs of an enduro bike. This KS2 linkage setup offers a lot of pedaling support. At times, maybe a little bit too much because it can be slightly uncomfortable. It does really, when you start laying down the power, it wants to stand up tall, and that means that the rear end is not particularly active. So when you're pedaling through rougher terrain, you do get a little bit of saddle feedback, and it's maybe not giving you quite as much grip as the most plush enduro bikes out there. But that's a different story once you get onto the downhills. For the smoother fire road climbs, it makes it an absolute pleasure. The seated position is nice and comfortable. The long rear end means that even if it's smooth and steep, you've got plenty of weight on that front wheel, even with that high stack. And the result is a bike that's definitely a happy climber, just slightly more on the efficient and firm side of things when you're trying to pedal through the chunk. There's no getting away from it. This is a heavy bike. It's got a sticky set of tires on it. But the resulting overall pedaling characteristic is not horrific. You're not going to want to spec the bike like this if all you're doing is covering huge miles. You definitely want to consider a slightly faster roll-in, slightly lighter weight tire set especially, maybe lighter weight wheels as well. But for the majority of what I've been riding anyway, which is fairly smooth fire road climbs or lift assisted and then absolutely charging the way down, it's been absolutely top notch. On the way down that hill, that 155mm rear travel being less than most enduro bikes was not once on my mind. This is a bike that absolutely gets the most out of its 155mm travel, and that 27% progression combined with a hydraulic bottom out on that coil shock meant that there were only a couple of instances where I even felt the notion of a bottom out, and I was really trying to find it. The geometry is solid, definitely having that slightly shorter reach combined with quite high stack and quite a long rear end feels really nice and stable and confident. You get a nice upright position, but you feel really centered between the wheels. And it just means you can kind of stand there and just let the wheels do their thing independently. The combination of that coil sprung rear end with the new Zeb up front meant that suspension performance was absolutely buttery smooth, really helping to iron out the kind of micro chatter on the trail and just leave you concentrating on what's way up ahead instead of what's down below your tires. The soft and sticky Continental rubber definitely helped things there, but the overall notion was just of real, trail muting, just taking out that micro chatter and the feedback and just keeping you trucking along. And it was an absolute pleasure. One thing I did find was a slight detriment to the overall comfort was the frame stiffness when it came to the ultra kind of chunky, awkward, rooty, off-camber sections of the Tweed Valley in Scotland, my local testing terrain. I did find that this rear end was slightly more prone to deflecting. It is very stiff, The wheels kind of packaged in a really stiff structure in that rear end. This wheel set is not a super compliant alloy wheel set either. And I did find there was a couple of times where the rear end would just deflect rather than hugging on for dear life, like some of the more flexible, more compliant, whatever you want to call it, bikes can do. When it came to the Alps, where you're typically more gravity fed, typically charging that little bit harder, it was never a problem. Meant that squaring off berms and really just pushing the bike hard was an absolute pleasure. But yeah, there's definitely a little bit of give and take sometimes with frame stiffness, overall bike stiffness, and this definitely errs on the slightly stiffer side of things for an alloy enduro bike for sure. Definitely a pleasure in certain situations though. I wouldn't necessarily say this is a playful bike. The rear end is quite long and it's not a lightweight machine either, but it still retained enough pop and play kind of capabilities to keep me happy playing around in the bike park. That said, it absolutely came alive when it was slightly rougher, steeper, just generally more gnarly, rather than in the most groomed flow trails. Although there is nice support in that suspension, meaning you can really work the terrain for speed and keep things moving along just fine. Talking about the overall quality of the finish, this Banshee is a really nicely put together frame. Internal cable routing worked well and kept things nice and quiet. I'd have liked to see slightly more generous, I guess, frame protection on there. The chainstay protector did an okay job, but you still got some chain slap from time to time, and there's nothing on that down tube, which I'd like to see changed. It's a nice rubber guard on there. And my singular real complaint with the 29er wheel fitted as they come standard is that their tyre clearance in the back there just isn't that great. With that Continental Cryptotile, the gap between the tyre and the, I guess, rear end brace is so minimal that there is many occasions where you hear kind of stones getting pulled around by the tyre and then getting spat out by the frame. And although I didn't really test this bike in super sloppy conditions, you can imagine that it's going to pack up, especially if you're pedaling through snow or something, which I've had frames with much more clearance pack up before. Yeah, it's definitely something to be mindful of. Of course, if you have the smaller rear wheel in there, it's going to be less or probably not an issue at all. But yeah, with the full 29er setup, which did perform really nicely, otherwise tyre clearance was not fantastic in there. And that's with an already fairly long rear end. I guess it is just the drawbacks of going for a dual link system like this. I did also have issues with the rear dropouts coming loose. I imagine that some stronger Loctite would have resolved the issue, but yeah, 4 or 5 times during testing, they did shake loose and need quite a lot of torque to get them back up to spec, so it's not really something you're going to be able to do out on the trail that easily. Otherwise, this bike has been absolutely trouble-free, an absolute pleasure to test. It's high quality throughout, the build spec's been fantastic, excellently selected by BC Suspension, and I firmly believe it's up there with some of the best enduro bikes on the market. It is really a dialed bike that has been an absolute pleasure to test. Thank you very much for watching this video on the Banshee Titan V3.2, an absolutely solid enduro bike and a bike that's been an absolute pleasure to test. If you've enjoyed it, give us a like, leave us a comment, let us know if you have any questions on this bike or any feedback from riding one yourselves, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more awesome content and awesome bikes like the Banshee Titan. Thank you for watching, catch you out on the trails.